I also lost my plastic.
All happy and confident technologically.
Okay, so I'm doing presenter view on Google Slides, and I think we got the presentation to be on the monitor, but now it's showing just the NIME screen.
Oh yeah, I just changed the HDMI input. I'll switch it back when you present.
Perfect. Oh, okay, great. Okay, awesome.
So you're all happy and everything?
Yes.
Cool.
Oh, I quit out the tab. Could we do it all again, or can you see what they are going to say?
You got a minute or two if you want to show. Give me a bit. I want to see it now. Let's see. There we go.
Okay.
How's that look behind you?
Oh, so that is my presenter notes. So can we exit out of that?
Yeah, exit out of that and swap it over.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay.
Do you have any audio in your presentation at all?
I do, but I actually don't think I'm going to play the video.
Got it.
Yeah. Should I tell you now?
Just make sure your sound outputs to the HDMI output.
Okay. Sound. Okay.
You got output up here?
Yeah. I think I'm just going to move this over here.
And can you full screen that?
Yes. Okay, great.
That's looking good to me. We're Are you happy for me to go ahead and talk for a minute or two? We're good. You're all good? Excellent. It's going to be great.
Good morning, everybody. Oh, that's loud. I should have started with testing 1, 2. My name is John Ferguson. Welcome to, I think it's session 8. This is going to be a fantastic session. Some really great people in it. Let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we gather, pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who may be here. In Australia, we work on unceded lands. It's always been a place of learning, teaching, research, and music making, so that's really important. I love any paper with the word hacking in it, so please give it up for Margaret Needham and Hacking Sound, Hacking History.
Hello, good morning. Very brave to come out this morning. Thank you very much. I'm Maggie, and today I'm going to talk about a NIME that is not my own. I'm going to talk about the artist and researcher Patricia Cadavid and her electronic quipu. Some of you may be familiar with this instrument. She presented it at NIME a couple of years back. So today I'm basically presenting a framework with which to see the electronic quipu, a framework which I think does a good job of explaining how and why it works in more of a social cultural lens. So first we're going to go through some background information and then explore some context around the dominant understandings of the quipu, and then go through how, as I argue, the electronic quipu hacks those understandings. So first I wanted to give a shout out to some of the thinkers, collectives, and mentors that influenced my theorizing on this project. Obviously Patricia Cadavid's own theoretical work, but also some other awesome people I encourage you to check out. Let's start with what a quipu is. A quipu is an information storing device that was used in the Wari and the Inca empires, and even before then. Quipus consist of a main cord with subsidiary cords that have information literally knotted into them. In the Incan Empire, quipus recorded census data, labor data, calendars, cosmological information, sacred places, and more. Those who make and read quipus are called quipuca mayuks, and it was a highly specialized role in the Inca Empire. Under Spanish colonial rule, quipuca mayuks were initially utilized. However, at the end of the 16th century, quipus were deemed idolatrous and were ordered to be burned. So a vast amount of knowledge on quipus has been forcibly lost through colonization, and you can see in my image credits even that quipus are now primarily stored in archives across Europe and the US. However, it's important to note that the practice of making quipus has actually continued into the present, with quipus being made to conceal rebellions, to count herds and to even enumerate sins in confession well into the 20th century. And quipus have also been incorporated into modern and contemporary art, as we will later explore. However, outside of these small pockets of quipu making, the dominant understanding of quipu is what you would see in like a travel brochure, in a museum, or in a pop science article, shows the quipu as this unsolved mystery, like mystical, even magical, devices of surprising complexity, which makes you question like, why is it surprising, and does the complexity of the technology reflect the worth of a people? And I'm just going to give a content heads up for a YouTube screenshot that I'm going to show with pretty like stereotypical AI generated image. As you can see from this video, you can see how easily like this exoticized view of the quipu can become super disconnected from its people, from its history, and from its voice. In the early 1900s, and kind of the first wave of anthropology, Western scholars studied the quipu for the first time. They were very focused on cracking the quipu, kind of Da Vinci Code style, adding up the number of knots, like multiplying by 7, adding 3, in order to like solve it. And they were also very embroiled in kind of racist and colonial frameworks such as social Darwinism, and often assumed the supremacy of a written language over any other system. And despite a real turn away from those views and increased ethnographic practices, a lot of those trends of scholarship have continued into the present, and there are now using data science to kind of use open databases to work to crack the quipu code. And obviously an important part of quipu research should be trying to understand the knowledge that has been lost, but this overwhelming emphasis on data has turned quipus into what anthropologist and activist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui calls codes without a message. Quipus were inspiration for Peruvian artists in the 20th century who were mostly interested in the aesthetics of it and kind of its status as this kind of pure indigenous art. In contemporary art, the quipu has continued to serve as this like inspiration/reclamation, most prominently by the artist Cecilia Vicuña, who had this big exhibit at the Guggenheim a couple of years back where she created room-sized quipus. And I was really interested in how she talked about it as kind of set in the past, and how art critics talked about it, a portal to an unplaceable time somewhere distant and fabled, which kind of brings up these recurring views of the quipus. So what would it look like to offer up a different vision of the quipu? I'm actually not going to play a clip, but I encourage you to check out this performance from 2019. But the electronic quipu consists of a main chord and subsidiary chords made out of rubber. They are sensitive to a performer's touch, with each chord producing fluctuating MIDI values that are, in this performance, tied to sounds such as a rain stick, recorded wind, an Argentinian drum, and protests in Colombia. In this paper, I argued that understanding the electronic quipu as an act of hacking allows us to fully see its power. And why even talk about hacking? Well, first of all, I like the connotations that the term brings, but it's also important to understand that the electronic quipu isn't just updating an old technology, but actually acting on structures of power. In this paper, I build off of a pretty narrow set of definitions from feminist and anti-colonial theory. I'm going to read the second. To connect, disconnect, buffer, network, scrap, etc., various composites of code and language and form novel couplings. One of the principal modes of hacking that's happening here is within the tactility of the electronic quipu. The quipu strands are sensitive to a performer's skin, conductivity, touch, and force, and this is emphasized by the streaming overhead video of the nodding. The quipu has always been a tactile medium. Quipuka maics can feel the difference between two types of fibers that may appear similar on a computer screen, but would have totally different meanings. Quipus were also potentially used as a soothing mechanism during the forced confessions, and the tactility of the instrument also highlights the blurred line between ritual and artistic practices and administration that is often so starkly divided in academic studies. Counting, inscription, and computation are not in opposition to creativity and the sacred. Likewise, quipus are meant to be read out loud, and by presenting an immediate connection to sound through the nodding, Cadavid hacks this continual silencing of quipus, the insistence that this is just another form of writing, or that quipus belong in the past. Its coding, rather than being obscured into an exoticized silence, makes itself heard through music, and specifically through a dynamic selection of sound sources that blur the boundaries between generic and personal, institutional and resistant, technological and natural. Related to this, one thing I was really interested in was the parallels between the portrayal of the quipu as a mystery and something that is almost magical, and NIME's mapping problem. And I think the instrument lands in this place of allowing some connection to be obviously made with seeing the nodding and their connection to sound, but also retaining an air of magic that is outside of these exoticized views, but rather a magic of reverence and ritual. So that's kind of a brief overview, but you can kind of get a sense for how Cadavid has deconstructed and constructing and selecting her elements carefully and precisely. Hacking doesn't need to be just tweaking lines of codes within an existing framework. The electronic quipu hacks colonial academic and artistic understandings of the quipu to create an ultimately richer understanding of the device and its role in the present moment. It joins this legacy of past quipus while also being keenly attuned to what a quipu would need to look like today and its role in resistance. I also just wanted to say a quick meta point, which is that I believe that NIMEs or NIME performances can and should be analyzed as media objects, and we don't necessarily need to take into account what the artist says a NIME is doing, and rather can have a more open space for discussions on the social and political values presented in these instruments. Thank you very much.
Wow, so much in that. Questions? Questions and thoughts in the rooms? Excellent.
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much. Quick question. Basically, could you just expand on the very last point that you made? I think that's extremely interesting. Could you say more?
I think that I come from a background of I'm really interested in music technology and NIMEs, but I also in college I did a lot of gender studies and music analysis of different things that were happening in streaming services or in different online communities that were dedicated to music. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of expand that analysis of the social implications and maybe what could be politically dangerous in those communities to NIMEs and kind of use a more humanities-based approach to NIME research. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh, now you can. Yeah, that was an excellent paper. Thank you very much. My question is about the material of the quipu. So you're talking about digital to quipu, but then also kind of reclaiming the tactility. Could you speak a bit to the history of the materials of the instrument and how you see them evolving?
Yeah. So quipus were traditionally made in the Warrior and Inca empires with wool and different types of fiber, and then sometimes had stones or different materials knotted into them. And one thing that was interesting about the Cecilia Vicuña exhibit in the Guggenheim was that she incorporated a lot of different materials and totally had these huge sculptural quipus. And then I thought it was interesting that Cadavid decided to return just to a cord structure. They're made out of rubber and they track the touch and pressure and sensitivity. They're very sensitive. And yeah, I thought that was an interesting choice to, rather than go sculptural or use the knotting as an inspiration, to have the knotting be more of a process than an end result of having something knotted. Yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you for this great talk. The way you talk about how she designed the instrument makes me think of it almost like an archival object that you can kind of experience history through. And that makes me think about how mappings carry bias and how we can kind of work that into an archival system of acknowledging that bias or how can be addressed.
Yeah, that's super cool. I feel I don't know, the archive was a huge theme throughout the research of this project because a lot of quipus either exist in I don't know, the Smithsonian or the local Andean villages that anthropologists have only discovered recently that they were there. And I don't know, I think it would be interesting to see this as a continuing of a different archival practice or yeah, that's cool.
Thank you.
Could probably do one more question if there's one out there. Maybe a really quick one from me. That was a super dense paper. Thank you so much in it. Just the words hacking, and then when you were talking about scale, I would love to just ask you to say a little bit more about the relationship between hacking and scale, like how you see those things.
Scale?
Scale, yeah, you're talking about upscaling the...
I don't know. I feel like I wasn't like super thinking about scale in that, but I would like to go back and delve more into that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, that's good. Maybe that was a mean question, just curious. Please put your hands together. That was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. So next up we have Sally Jane Norman, also involving John Bowers and Paul Stapleton. And I'm sure Sally Jane is going to tell us about some paperwork she has in the foyer, the zine to be picked up. Oh. Excellent. Please welcome Sally Jane Norman.
Thank you. Yunga, and thanks, John, and thanks to the NIME reviewers who helped us get over the hurdles. There were a few, but they kindly recommended, actually, that we add a zine to our paper. In fact, they said maybe we should do a zine instead of a paper, but we said, no, we'll do both. So you're stuck with it. So I'd just like to say that I do speak for and with my co-authors, John Bowers and Paul Stapleton, to defend the creative strategies that we feel are needed to embrace the risks inherent to live performance. I think people perhaps know John. He's, for his artistic exploration of digital technologies and interaction, he's authored lots of NIME and Kai type activities. But this is also underpinned by his pioneering computer-supported cooperative work. He was co-founder of the CSCW Journal in 1992, and we first collaborated in the mid-90s in that capacity. Paul, many of you probably also know, he's got numerous NIME-related activities that foreground his instrument in sound design and performance and critical improv, research into social interaction and entrainment and algorithmic listening, amongst other things. My activities, I'm a bit of a weirdo here, which I guess I am everywhere, go back to my pre-NIME legacy. I was STEM artistic co-director for the late 90s. And in 98, together with Misha Weiswitz and Joel Ryan as a triumvirate, we ran STEIM's first Touch Festival. So we did quite a few STEIM gigs at IRCAM and at NIME. And so I've been involved indirectly and directly since at NIME. And last year, as a frequent online participant, caught these guys, John and Paul in Utrecht, and I was extremely jealous and sent them my NIME Envy slide. And on that basis, we said, okay, we're going to do something this year. So we proposed this misusers manual. Please note that we are keen supporters of NIME. We're tuned, of course, to its workshop beginnings at ACM, and we're appreciative of its growing diversification. Once it did look at times like an old boys self-mirroring network that I called Toys for Boys. But we're also concerned about why the singular creative energies of live performance are still too often deemed secondary to tech advances, however important those tech advances may be, and we're well aware of that. So we echo several of this week's presenters. When musical expression that's determinant for NIME sometimes seems to be siloed as concerts or artistic keynotes, and I think Maggie just expressed this beautifully in her last comments. There are a few openings for performers without academic affiliations. So we want to foreground performance practice-based research that explores the now of live improvisation as critical to NIME's identity and development. So why this misusers manual? Well, how-to manuals, they tend to smooth user paths and soothe user frustrations. That's their goal. And they overlook the creative potential of what we see as critical, which is failure, errors, forgetfulness, and misuse. Oversimplification, over-engineering, this all misses the necessary messiness of artistry. So what we propose is to address openness to failure as a creative strategy, Explore interfacings as a new I for NIME. I mean, quite a few people have been pushing for this for years. Find value in inefficient machines and the apparently superfluous or mistargeted. Rescue performance from the demo so that we can foreground improvisation in a shared now. Poke at inherited metaphor, challenge attempts at fixed orderliness, and reframe topics to kickstart collaboration based on vibrant uncompromise and festive dissent. And some of these principles you'll see in the zine, and we welcome additions to these. We have an inconclusive non-conclusion. There's a GitHub link at the end of the zine and at the end of our paper. So I'll just touch on some of our watchwords here. Openness to failure is a creative strategy. We know that unpredictability and accidents and failure are intrinsic to dynamically evolving processes. Reorganizational plasticity is what allows adaptation to and integration of unforeseeable factors. I mean, if we're in a philosophy that assumes that all errors have to be caught, explained, and corrected, we're ruling out the operation of a system as complex as the living organisms that we are. Because, of course, we integrate and operate across errors. And I'm just quoting Van Neumann on this. Creative systems have to go beyond reproducibility ideals that are belied by the social construction of scientific facts. So that, of course, comes from Latour and Woolgar and Bachelard and lots of others. So this is why we see openness to failure as a creative strategy. Multiple ways of making offer unforeseen opportunities, and these are offset by unforeseen instances of possible failure. You can't have one without the other. Experimentation that treats failure as a friend and success as an imposter lends itself to cultures of music making and technological excitement, noting, of course, that excitement can be as full of trepidation as it is of elation. So multiplication of conditions for failure, this is what makes us more agile and less easy to predict and to control. These are images that John will be familiar with from our Wayback Machine at Culture Lab. And exploring interfacings as a new I for NIME, again, we're not the first people to propose this, but like musicking, which Sandy mentioned yesterday, of course, I'm very happy that musicking was invented by a Kiwi, Christopher Small, but interfacing has all the potency of a verb. It drives performance that's committed to Barrett's wonderful terms, ethico-onto-epistemologies, intertwining of ethics, knowing, and being. Simon Waters is somebody who's extremely important for our work, and Simon says, what's important is creating spaces for inspiration, spaces where contentious thinking can be productive, and ways to take these energies beyond the perimeters of closed communities. And I think Claire's keynote wonderfully touched on this. How do we get out of what might sometimes become our siloed community? Simon has a wonderful paper called The Entanglements Which Make Instruments Musical, Rediscovering Sociality. So that's a 2021 paper. And it's an important one for all of us, I think. This guy, some of you probably know, Owen Green. Instead of purposely making purposeful tools, we need to learn how to mobilize ambiguity and indeterminacy creatively to engender multiple relationships and identities. So how can we reconcile NIME's interfacing activities and aspirations, including the technological path dependencies to which they're necessarily subject, with openness to the alternative frameworks that are needed to invigorate musical expression? So this is from Owen's NIME performance of a few years back, his Race to the Bottom, Boeing cardboard. Owen points out that practice-led research complements quantitative controlled condition methods to contend with musical practice in its local, socially entangled, contentious and noisy complexity. So what can we bend or reimagine to make all NIME participants effectively engage with the messiness of performance practice? We have questions, not answers. We've got to find value in inefficient machines, in the apparently superfluous or mistargeted. So these guys, that's Adnan, Marcus Bourbon, and Paul Stapleton, running one of their, what they called tragic experiments. So the tin can telephones are pretty highly equipped pieces of kit. They've got embedded speakers and ambisonic systems, and you can wander around Sark with them, and obviously it's a real mix of the old and the new. And these kinds of tragic experiments are also a John Bauer's specialty. Pocket inherited metaphor. So here's John definitely challenging attempts at fixed orderliness, and definitely doing what John does so well in his performance ecologies world, getting into the messiness of artistic practice. And another thing that for us is really important, and I really loved the drummers and percussionists at this conference. Thank you so much, you're in the groove. Revel in motor abundance to generate shared resonances that articulate dissensual grooves. Dissensual grooves can be very sensual. Scott Latache has this notion of motor abundance that offers a counterweight to the gestural economies and the frugal ergonomics that often tend to govern, quite rightly in many cases, interface developments. But for musicians, this is often far too restrictive. In this image, Conor McCauley, who's the drummer in the middle, discovered that his flawed imitation of a Chris Corsano technique that he worshipped actually turned out to be far more positive than accurate replication, and it opened up a whole bunch of new musical pathways. So we suggest that we have to forget our preconceptions, we have to forget all that's supposedly trusted, true, and worthy, and take the risk to revel in motor abundance, uninhibited motor abundance. The other one that's perhaps a little along the same lines, rescue performance from the demo. I'm sort of citing, of course, Negroponte from 1985. It doesn't go away. We have to prove by doing, which is what Negroponte said. But the problem is that we risk undermining the artistic value of live improvisatory performance that demarcates NIMEs from other interface developers if we're simply showcasing demos. If the demo presentation is considered to be a performance, then where does that leave actual musical performance? And I realize this is a blurred area. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying we need to challenge it and question it. Foreground improvisatory action in a shared now. Well, Christina Anderson is obviously sharing her now with a very friendly artifact, and her magic machines have been incredibly influential in design and NIME circles. And for Michel, his composing the now is anchored in this improvisatory engagement with a very singular interface. So this is not well, it is, we'll see in a minute. There's been iterative prototyping around the hands, but this is an instrument that has been refined over decades in all of its idiosyncratic glory. It's demonstration of what Phil Agra wonderfully calls deep diversity. Phil had a paper about deep versus shallow diversity, which I think really deserves rereading. Rethink technological and organological time through the now of live performance. So here are some of the iterations of Michel's hands, fortunately preserved by the wonderful Christina Anderson. There's a pathos, I think, about Michel's commitment to the now and these holy relics. And Christina's very careful about how we deal with this kind of legacy. When do we autopsy and when do we revive these things that are in the DMI graveyard at NIME? But these questions of conservation and preservation, inspiration for emerging artists, which is what Maggie so wonderfully pointed to with Patricia Cadavid's work. When and how do we deal with this? How do we respect legacies and at the same time bounce off of them and go further? When do we consider them as generative because they're sedimented and they concede future manifestations? Theories of material engagement, legacies of physical objects are real things. They are seeds for the future. So how can we uphold the now of performance across multiple temporally hybridized systems? And this is our last ultimatum that I'm going to cite today. There are lots more in the zine, and there are many, many more in the paper. And out of respect for my collaborators, co-authors, please, please, please read the paper. What we're suggesting is that we need to reframe our topics of interest so that we can kickstart new kinds of collaboration that are based on vibrant uncompromise and festive dissent. And I've been hearing a lot of this throughout the week from other wonderful presenters, and it's just really good knowing that these echoes are coming up, and we have a fantastic opportunity this afternoon to discuss them in the town hall. But I do think that working out how we pose our questions, where we're speaking from, and who we're trying to speak to are really important matters. So just on these terms, festive dissent, this comes from Holzer's concept of dissensus. He says that artistic fictions hollow out conventional realities constructs and the inherited so-called common sense. So that seems to be a pretty good mot d'ordre. Dynamic uncompromise was actually a term from Jeff Balker, but we just stuck the word vibrant in there. Balker uses dynamic uncompromise as a way to designate the creative tensions that arise when singularities are upheld. And then there's another term that's in our paper very prominently, which is the feminist Maria Lugonis's term, curdling, which denotes exercising impurity and resisting arbitrary separations. This seems important when we're discussing entanglement. We were trying to find other ways of looking at and framing these questions of entanglement. When hybrids, or forgive my pronunciation, mestizaje, I'm sorry, I'm sure there are people who can say this much better than me, but these are deemed inadmissible. So we need to find ways of bringing them into the same framework when we pose these questions, and curdling is possibly a very good way to do that. So I think, yeah. Oh, sorry, I just had. Ooh. Oh, great. And these are just the image credits. But please, we don't have conclusions. We have non-conclusions, inconclusive conclusions, which consist of throwing out a challenge. We've got a GitHub link, and we would love people to throw things into it, throw ideas into it, get back to us. And the reviewer, I think the one who really hated our paper, who suggested that we do a zine, I'm really grateful. And if that person is in the room, please take lots of them and stick pins in them or do whatever you like. But so I'm speaking for Paul and John, and I'm really sorry they can't be here, but I'm hoping that some of this resonates for some of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally Jane. Lots of hands straight away. Questions?
Hi. Yes. Thank you for your presentation. I was thinking a lot about the failure as a creative strategy, and that made me think about sinful design. So I was thinking, do you have any strategies for NIMErs to identify the scenes or working with the scenes so that we can fully embrace the failure as a creative strategy?
I would hope that we're all doing it all the time. There's no such thing as fail-safe. I find that a really weird word. I think being less inhibited, and several people here have wonderfully talked about the importance of process over product. And there was a beautiful yesterday's talk about a sonic installation practice and its performativity. And all those things are full of risk. And I just think we have to recognize and be respectful of the risk that people are taking. They're avoiding the so-called fail-safe. Because fail-safe is just deadness, Liveness has failure within it. So it's not a specific response. I can't give you the last thing we would do is give anybody guidelines. We just say, Beckett, we quoted him in our paper, try, fail, fail better, you know? Fail again, fail better. It's really important. And I don't think I can answer any better than that. It's a failed answer, haha.
Hi, thanks so much. I think I'm really interested in sort of like debunking the idea of the user and the sort of like the misuser's manual. So are you borrowing, concepts from like what it means to be a user, or are you trying to sort of devolve the idea of a user altogether?
That's a nice question. Thank you. I think we're talking about ecologies of interactions, and I think that this the focus on user and the word utilitarian tool cropped up yesterday is very misleading, because we're talking about wider environments. So I'm also concerned that, why in users' manuals we soothe frustrations and smooth pathways is because we have a notion of a normative user, which is rubbish. There were some really wonderful inaccessibility papers yesterday that pointed out how wrong all that notion is of normative usage and normative user. So it's broadening this question into a processual question, an ecology of interaction. And there's been so much talk about agency, the crossings over of interagential systems and, human and non-human and all the rest of it. And we're all post-Anthropocene and, all this kind of stuff. But I think it's really a matter of trying to embrace a wider environment with all of its temporalities that are tied up together, curdled and tangled, whatever. So it's that dichotomy of user, use, tool, which is really problematic. That's why Simon's text on musical instruments as social systems strikes me as incredibly important. I hope that answers.
Probably got time for one very quick one.
Go on. Yay. That's reveling in gesture, right?
Fascinating talk. There's a lot of things I could talk about later. There's not latency. How much of this do you think is a sort of, I don't know, ideas for how we should conduct ourselves internally to a community like NIME, within this community? And what does this mean for how the people here in this room, the people in the broader NIME community, should kind of engage with other musical communities outside of NIME? What are the kind of outward-looking implications that you see?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a question that Claire pointed to really keenly in her keynote. I do feel that getting beyond these crazy institutionally dictated notions of wider civic engagement, impact, patent this and engage with that. We've got to cut through that rubbish, but that puts the onus on us all the more heavily to try to find ways to engage beyond what is a really privileged community here. And I feel incredibly fortunate to be here. I really do. But then I feel that I have a responsibility to see how I can leverage these connections and these energies to see how to take them elsewhere. And we've all got very different ways of doing that in our communities. In Aotearoa, we've got very different ways of trying to hook up with places that are beyond the institution, that represent totally different knowledge forms, indigenous knowledge forms, for example. But I think everybody in their specific contexts has specific ways of getting into and getting their teeth into systems that get beyond their institutional hubs. Is that a sort of an answer? Thanks. Cheers.
We probably do need to move on. Please thank Sally Jane for a
Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you.
So, is it beginning for online? Yeah. Does it get any darker than that? Cool. And is Derek Brown good to go?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm pressing all the wrong buttons. Please welcome Derek Holzer. I think all ready to go.
Hi, I hope everybody can hear me out there. I'm speaking to you from 8 hours in the past because it's about 1:40 in the morning here in Stockholm. And going to present a paper which was the kind of the culmination of the last 5 years of work that I've been doing in my recently completed PhD. I feel like I'm definitely on the right panel in the right place here after seeing Maggie and Sally Jane's presentations. And I think I'm going to be introducing a theme of willful misinterpretation here. So I'm gonna share my screen, and I'm not going to be able to see anything from any of you. So here we go. Okay, great. And I'm going to start a timer so I don't talk over time. So this paper is entitled The Imperfect Copy, Role-Playing Reenactments of Historical Electronic Sound Instruments. I'm the principal author, as it's been a big part of my PhD research. My two supervisors are Henrik Frisk from the Royal College of Music here in Stockholm and André Holzapfel from KTH Royal Institute of Technology, where I've been doing my studies. The main problem we're going to be talking about here is the preservation of historical electronic sound instruments and how to plan a future for objects of the past. In this little presentation here, I'm going to talk about some more conventional means of preserving instruments, which involve conservation, maintenance, and reproduction of them as objects. I'm going to cover a framework for analyzing some of the more non-cochlear aspects of some of these instruments. So some of the more contextual, social, political, historical, conceptual, artistic aspects of these instruments, which may not be obvious in their perceived sound output. Following that, I'm going to talk about some methods for reenacting these instruments based on this framework of analysis. And finally, I'm going to give a case study of a role-playing workshop that we conducted from a museum archive collection here in Sweden, which has been the basis of my research. When we talk about preserving historical instrument of any kind, really, but we're going to talk specifically about historical electronic sound instruments. There's three tactics that generally get taken, particularly in museum conservation or in museum work, but in lots of other areas as well. There's conservation, there's maintenance, and there's reproduction. Each one of these approaches has a very specific measure of fidelity to the original instrument, which are very specific to each one of their focuses. So if we're conserving an instrument, the main aim here is to preserve it in its historical condition. Pip Lawrenson, who is the conservator, was the conservator for time-based media at the Tate Modern in London, talks about a kind of an authenticity. And this is a very problematic word for a lot of reasons, but what she talks about when she talks about authenticity of a museum object is a kind of a fidelity to something that's specific to the discipline. So when we're dealing with a historical object, then the material integrity of that object is the most important thing. And any changes to the integrity of it, for example, if you lose a part or somebody comes in and throws a can of soup on your painting in the museum or something like that, then you've compromised the material integrity of that object, and it's somehow deemed less authentic. When you're talking about a scientific exhibition or in a scientific context, then it's a demonstration of function, and that is actually the chief domain there, is to preserve it in its functionality. And finally, when we're in an arts context, We're talking mostly about the fidelity or the authenticity of the artistic intentions, what the artist intended for that artwork to be presented like. And there's, in all of these areas, a lot of room for interpretation. When we're preserving something, the main idea here comes very close to that of the sciences. We're preserving it in terms of its function. Now, when I've been talking about conservation, my model of conservation has been this Swedish Museum of Performing Arts that I've been working in their archive a lot. And when an instrument goes into their collection, it's not really intended to be played ever again. It becomes a document which gets stored. That document can be accessed and read, so to speak, by looking at it, or it can be placed in an exhibition to be observed. But it's not a functional object anymore. In contrast, the Elektron Musikstudion, which is EMS, it's a state-run music studio in Stockholm where people apply to do residencies. They keep a very large collection of vintage electronic instruments in working order in order that the members and the people who apply for the residencies have instruments that they can come in and play immediately. So when you're trying to maintain something, you're trying to keep it functional. And Lawrenson, again, makes a distinction between parts of the instrument which are purely functional and a museum viewer, in her case, wouldn't see. For example, maybe the power supply doesn't need to be some noisy thing from 1956 when you can put a completely modern and efficient power supply, behind the case or something like that. But when when aspects of that equipment become more conceptual or aesthetic or historical, then you get more, there's a lot more to work with there. I'm thinking a little bit of Dan Flavin's fluorescent light installations, for example. Would those look the same with an LED strip? Absolutely not. So there's a certain amount of preservation that you would need to think of just materially, because that's what the artist's intentions are. Lawrenson has this wonderful phrase that she says, inexact substitution. So you can try to reproduce the functional parts of these machines as close as you can to the original, or you can start substituting things in different ways. Does that video installation need a CRT monitor? Can it be done on a flat screen? Can it be done with a video projector? You start to get into these layers of how much you can change it. Reproduction works in a lot of different ways. The example that I'm showing here is actually Behringer, the synthesizer, an audio equipment company, making budget reproductions of old vintage synthesizers like the Wasp from the early 1970s. So reproduction happens in the commercial world, and it also happens in the museum world, and it also happens in the world of research, where we take something and we try to either physically reconstruct it, or we make a digital emulation of it. And oftentimes we try to make a combination of both. There's this wonderful reproduction of Daphne Orum's Oramix machine, which was done quite recently in London. And that instrument is kind of a combination of some analog processes, some mechanical processes, and a lot of digital emulation. There's also the electronic sackbut, which is a very early Canadian electronic music instrument, which has been reproduced in a number of ways using either very physical analog or very digital ways, and combinations of these sort of methods. A reproduction is most often evaluated in terms of its fidelity to how the original instrument looked or felt as you were playing it, and definitely how it sounded. So there's very material and quite measurable things that you can compare the reproduction with in order to say how much fidelity you have to the original. So we've spent a lot of time unpacking what we decided not to do in this approach, and I want to get into a little bit more what we did want to do here. So rather than comparing the instrument in material or sonic terms to its original, what we wanted to do was to look at some of the other, what Seth Kim Cohen would call the non-cochlear aspects of it. So the very conceptual aspects of it, aspects which are a bit less tangible, but have a very strong influence on how the instrument was developed and how it was used over time. These aspects can be social, they can be political, they can be historical, they can be conceptual. So we're getting into the intentions of the artist. They can be contextual, they can be, there's all sorts of areas where you can start to analyze these things. And some of them are more apparent in how the machine might look or feel or sound, and some of them are not. We proposed that we can look at 4 areas of an instrument and get an idea what we might want to work with. And those areas are the features, which are probably the most material aspect of it, the affordances, which is the kind of intra-relation and the entanglement of that object with the people who are using it, or the people who are entangled with it. Again, I'm also not a big fan of the term the user. It's who is using who in this case, right? Perhaps the machine is using the person. The context that the instrument was created under, and the applications that the instrument was intended for. So what is the instrument? How is it used? For whom was it intended? And why was it made in the first place? And also, how do those that encounter and interact with this instrument perhaps diverge from some of these intentions and some of these reasons why it was made? When we have answers to these questions, we can start to think about how we might reenact this instrument. There's a lot of theory behind this this kind of a framework. The chief article that I've been pulling from is a paper by Tresh and Dolan from 2013, where they're discussing an organology of instruments of both science and music. And they're claiming that instruments of both science and music can be analyzed using roughly similar ways of talking about them. Their categories of analysis are derived from Foucault's categories of ethical analysis. So we go from Foucault talking about the ethics of the self and what constitutes an ethical person and ethical actions, to what constitutes an instrument, how is it mediated to people that encounter it, what sort of rules does it follow, to what ends was it directed, these kind of questions. I found that in workshop situations, trying to explain to participants the difference between modes of mediation and map of mediations, already I would forget which one was which. And if I was forgetting it, then for sure the workshop participants were getting a little lost in the clouds as well. So what I tried to do was boil it down into some very simple questions that we can attach to terms that come up a lot in music instrument design or in HCI concepts as well. So the questions, what is the instrument, relate to its construction and functions. How is the instrument used, relates to its actions and mediation, or its affordances. For whom is the instrument intended, relates to its history and context. And why was the instrument made, relates to its intentions and uses, and also how people diverge from them. A reenactment is a big concept. I have an entire thesis publication sitting in my hand where I try to unpack it. But in the shortest way of talking about it, a reenactment could be a reconstruction or a digital emulation, or it could not be. It might involve aspects of these, or it might be something completely different. What the reenactment does is it explores these social, political, historical, conceptual, contextual, and material conditions that that instrument came out of. And it tries to find equivalents or discussions between those conditions and the conditions of our contemporary times. The result is a novel instrument realized through contemporary means, which reflects on contemporary concerns within a contemporary context. So again, it could be a very willful misinterpretation. It's the idea that we take aspects of this original instrument and translate them somehow. And it's very practice-based. It's very much about doing and an ongoing process. A reenactment can be thought of a little bit like a text score or a performance art script. I love these old Fluxus text scores, like Lamont Young's composition 1960, where he says, draw a straight line and follow it. Christina Anderson suggested to me Alison Knowles' wonderful Identical Lunch. The script of that simply being that you go to a certain place at a certain time and you order a very specific lunch every day for a week or well, a week, that's what she specifies, at approximately the same time. And her book, The Identical Lunch, from 1973, is journal entries of all these different people following this script and what happened to them when they did that. I'd also, in terms of music instruments, this particular example kind of popped out. I was looking a little bit at the Sonic Acts from 2024 that Christina Anderson was curating out of the archives of Michel Weiswitz's instruments. And this one came up, which is Boris Shashenkov's audio puller, which is based entirely on this photograph, which is just to the left of it, from approximately 1970 of Michel Weiswitz with apparently a piece of tape in his hand, and he's kind of pulling it around. But that is the only documentation of this instrument that exists, and from that, Shashenkov created his own interpretation of it quite freely, as a matter of fact. The case study that I wanted to present in the next couple of minutes before the clock goes boom is a live action role playing workshop that I conducted at the Swedish Museum of Performing Arts on the 60th anniversary of EMS. So the Electronic Music Studio in Stockholm was founded 60 years ago, and they brought in this very large collection of archival instruments to talk about the context of the studio and its history. The influences of this workshop, just to kind of drop a few names really quickly, you can dive into the paper, come from media archaeology. They come from Christine Anderson's Magic Machines workshops. They come from sources like sci-fi authors Ursula K. Le Guin and Octavia Butler, from participatory art and happenings, from design fiction, speculative and critical design practices, and of course from LARPing, from live action role playing. The idea was that we had a group of students, and we told them that they were archaeologists from the future. They were from the 51st century, and they were given this text, the tomb and its contents. You and your team of media archaeologists from the 54th century have discovered a tomb from the late 20th century containing objects you believe to be musical instruments. They are inscribed with hieroglyphics of an ancient language which you have never seen before and require a power source which you cannot determine. Your challenge is to figure out how they work. So with this frame narrative, we invited a group of students to the museum archive. When they got there, we gave them this text, which gave some context about the world of the 54th century that they were inhabiting as they moved into this frame narrative. Basically, during the 21st century, the planet Earth went through a blackout. Whatever source of power people used before then to operate technology and store their memories is gone. Since then, society has been rebuilt. From time to time, we uncover these tombs which ancient humans used for their technology, and this is one of them. And the tomb is the museum itself. Finally, we know very little about the 20th century. You've never seen objects like these before. You can't read anything that's written on them, and they could serve any imaginable function. So with that set of instructions, the participants were invited in. We turned off all the lights and all the electricity in the entire exhibition, and they went in with their flashlights and their mobile phone lights. And they looked at these things, and they tried to come up with their interpretation of what these things did. Running very short on time, I'm going to really direct you to the paper to get the deeper story of these. But they were some of them were fairly commonplace studio objects. For example, a Revox tape machine, which became a kind of a radio transmitter to talk to people in other galaxies. A reproduction of a Surge modular synthesizer, which became a kind of a controller for Sir Francis Bacon's sound houses. Channeling bioenergies. This small little suitcase designed by Huron Svensson became a container for some resonant strings that were plucked by human beings. It had 3 arms. And finally, kind of the showpiece of the exhibition, which is the original EMS Studio control console, which really deserves a paper of its own or a book of its own, became a kind of some kind of a touch-operated church organ that created religious ecstasy among groups of people. The outcomes of this workshop were that this kind of game that we constructed allows the participants to better understand how to analyze these instruments, because of course we talked about the different sort of categories we could use to analyze the instruments before we went in as well. But it also enabled the creation of new and novel instruments that reflect upon the world of the historical instruments, so our time, and the time that the game participants are living in. So whatever it is that they say about these things doesn't come from the 54th century, obviously. It comes from their own perspective. And it tells us a lot about what we see in technology and what our expectations of it. In some ways, what we've done is we've kind of imaginarily placed people in the future, looking through the present at things of the past. And the perspective that we gain actually is much less of the future and much less of the past, but it tells us a lot about our own implicit biases and our own ideas about what technology can do. There's a lot of ethical issues that I wanted to get into, which are in the paper a little bit, that have to do with the kind of the frame that you create when you do a LARP, and the kinds of things you can say within the context of a LARP, and then coming out of that LARP and applying what you learn in LARP to your everyday life through a process of integration. I am out of time at the moment, so I'm going to thank you for your kind attention, and I would love to take some questions if there's some time for that.
Thank you, Derek. That was really great. Do we have questions out there? Yay.
Bring them on.
Hello, Derek. Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Hey, lovely. Well, let me double check first. Are you aware, because I was reading it recently, a book by Caitlin DeSilva called Curated Decay?
Curated decay. Nope, I'm going to write it down.
Oh, cool. This is more of an invitation than a question. So really, it's looking at this idea of like heritage and how we let it go, because there's a little bit of a hoarder mentality. And it's just a really interesting way of kind of approaching that. That book is more aimed at like heritage architecture. Studies in there. So I'm going to email you with some links, and then get your.
That'd be wonderful. I obviously I like these interdisciplinary approaches because there's so much you learn from kind of copy pasting or dragging things from one field into another. So great, thank you.
Okay, because that wasn't a proper question, then I'll give you a try one. How many synthesizers do you need to have before you stop caring if one of them dies?
before you stop caring if one of them dies. I just spent the last 3 days trying to record an audio track, and I think every device that I touched died.
One more quick question out there? Anywhere?
Aha! I haven't read your paper yet, but I think it's coming at this kind of role-playing perspective. I think is really interesting and interests me a lot. I am curious about your mentality from, like, let's say, a curation and museum mindset of how would there be a way to incorporate that for people to live through history in maybe a different lens? If you have any ideas from that, from like a NIME perspective.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of doing this workshop now a couple of times. One time I did it in the museum, and another time we went to kind of the archive of the museum, which is completely separate from its public works. The archive of the museum looks a little bit like the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, where you kind of wheel the crate that everybody's been fighting and dying for into another pile of anonymous crates. So you walk into this archive and there's like harpsichords forever waiting for Armageddon or something like that. And so there's something quite sad about going into a room full of instruments that will never be played again. And finding some way of activating that space, I think, was even more interesting than going and activating a museum exhibition where somebody has really thought a lot about how to activate an audience and get them engaged with it. An archive is a very special place because it's very specialist. It's not a public place. It exists for a few people with a really deep interest, usually a professional interest, sometimes a nerdy interest. But besides that, these things are just sitting there. And so to bring people in to work in that kind of a space, it's a really different feel than doing it in a public place like a museum. And in some ways, that workshop was even more interesting. Simply because of the context of this room and these things that were otherwise quite gathering dust. I don't know how that answers your question exactly, but that's kind of where it took me associatively a little bit. Is how can we kind of reanimate these things and breathe life into them even when, like, you're not allowed to play them anymore is kind of one of my big concerns in this thing.
All right, very cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. That was really great. We will need to move on at that point, and we're sticking in the online world. But everyone, please thank Derek.
Thanks so much.
While we're doing the changeover, I'll just make a quick comment, which is there's some really nice resonances here between Derek's talk, the Fairlight booting from the SD card that we've seen, the Sally Jane's provocations around performance. So yeah, really nice to see the history as a catalyst coming together. So next up we have, excellent, Yann Seznec and the memory cloud. So hopefully we have you, and I will shut up.
You do have me. It's great. It's great to be here. Hello, and yeah, wow, really fantastic session so far. I feel somewhat humbled to be a part of it. So, but I'll just carry on and hope that it connects well enough. My name's Yann Seznec. I'm in the same part of the past as Derek. I'm in Stockholm eight hours before you. I'm a colleague of his at KTH. I'm doing my PhD, and I'm going to talk about my project, the memory cloud. So my cloud library is totally full. That graph probably looks familiar to some of you. At least I hope it does. I hope I'm not alone in this. And you're likely to be also getting pestered by various services to deal with your own similar situation, like my Dropbox and Gmail here. And I always feel that the implication of these, of course, is that of these types of messages is both, this is your fault, right? This is your fault, but that also, don't worry, you can buy your way out of this problem. This is just a problem solved with money. So I think there are a lot of really interesting aspects to this, but I'd like to focus on one in particular. And that is that this very full cloud library represents a very unique thing in terms of sound. A lot of the space-filling content that's filling up that graph is videos, and those videos all have sound. I work with sound, as do probably most people in the room listening to this. So I think it's interesting to try to think about it from that perspective. We are all effectively walking around with these massive, personally curated sound libraries, which have grown dynamically and organically over many years and are literally at our fingertips. And this feels somehow new and significant to me. So my work here is the result of a set of explorations around this specific situation, guided particularly by sustainable computing paradigms and working within very tight design constraints. So in short, I made an instrument called the memory cloud, which is designed to contain every sound in a person's cloud library. So the idea is that I started with was to take every single video in my cloud account to begin with. There were 1,261 videos, extract all the sounds from them, and then use them as a type of sound library. Of course, this isn't really every sound I've recorded, right? I have other microphones and a sound recording machine, and I record on my computer, something, etc. This is just the ones on my specific cloud account, and it's using my phone. However, I think this provides a very particular slice of life that's otherwise totally ignored. I think one of the things I find really interesting about it is that it's really low quality, right? It's like tons of wind noise. There are just literally dozens and dozens of happy birthday videos of like me singing happy birthday to somebody. And I've barely watched most of these videos. So I started by exporting all of the videos and generating my personal sound library. And these formed the basis of my own memory cloud instrument. Once I was happy with that, I went through the same process with another musician, which formed the basis of the paper that this talk is accompanying. So exporting all of these videos and creating a sound library was a total pain. And doing it for someone else is even more of a pain. And I mention this mainly because it's a really good illustration, I think, of the frictions of modern technology and how difficult it is to work against the intentions and the biases of the media ecologies that we inhabit, right? They don't want me to do this. They want me to buy more space. They don't want me to like use their little warning to upgrade my cloud storage space as a sort of stepping stone towards building an experimental musical instrument. It's unusual, but that's just how it is. Here are two of these memory clouds that I've made. There's the one for me, which is the one on the left, and one for a musician named Sam Best. While they're physically basically the same, and actually like the synths in them are not anything groundbreaking. The content they contain is radically different. So mine has about 1,200 sounds from the past 13 years of my life. Sam's has about 2,000 sounds from the past 10 years of his life. The instruments and the sounds they contain are thus totally associated with each of us separately. They're basically just granular synthesizers with a main twist, the main twist being there's a specific button for selecting a sound to play with. So all the sounds in the device have been shuffled. Pressing the button, pressing the loading button loads the next sound in shuffled order. So you don't know what it's going to be, and you can't go back to a previous sound until you've heard all of the sounds in the library. So I'll show you how that works in practice. I don't know if it's worth switching on your side the screen around, because I'm not going to I'm going to show here on my instrument. Yeah, perfect, exactly. So I'll switch it on. So you can hear a sound playing there, I hope. Very granular sounding. And you could probably hear pretty clearly, I don't know if you can tell that it's my voice, but that's my voice and some children's voices. And so this is some video that I made sometime in the past, presumably 7-8 years. I can play with it, of course. And I'll just demonstrate quickly that, so this button up here, when I press it, it will load another sound. I don't know what that sound's going to be. And I was very pleased to hear Sally J. Norman's discussion of unpredictability, accidents, and openness to failure. So I'm really, really, really open to failure here. We have no idea what's going to happen when I press that button. Ooh, there's another sound. So very brief demonstration there. And just as a small reflection on that, what's interesting to me, and probably not interesting to you, but interesting to me, is that I could actually hear that video, that sound that was the last thing that I just switched to there. I could tell immediately, even just from the tiny little grains of sound, I could tell immediately that it was a much more recent video, because the sounds of the kids there were much older than the previous ones. So it's obviously extremely tied into my own experience. Anywho, so where was I? Right. So these are the instruments. The paper itself is really about how the instrument was used by Sam Best and Yoshika Caldwell, two professional musicians based in England, who used Sam's memory cloud as a musical instrument for a while. They responded extremely strongly to two main aspects I'll mention here quickly. First was the personal aspect of the library itself, and how the sounds were so refreshing and led to a sort of humility around the use of it in a performance. So Yoshika said this: it's such a scrapbook of somebody's life, so intimate, that ambient noise, it's not constructed, which does resonate with the philosophy of the instrument. It's like all of the background stuff is all the important stuff, really, the stuff of everyday life, the noise, the laughing, the rustling. It's not performative in any way. And I think that is so mirrored in the instrument, because it feels like it's a tool to stimulate your thoughts about these sounds. The second aspect that they responded very strongly to was the impermanence of the selection of the sound, how when you press the button, it provides you with a new sound and you can't go back in it. But they found that very freeing, to be forced to choose to move on to a different sound. Yoshika put this very nicely. I was playing one sample, and Sam was like, the fun thing about it is you go forward and you can never get back to the previous sound. So you can never get attached to it, which I absolutely love. And immediately you make your peace with that. You immediately accept that you can't be attached to a sound. I think that's amazing and very freeing, because you feel like you are improvising with it. It feels like a two-way thing with the machine. You're not attached to the outcome being exactly the same. You want to capture the feeling and the essence rather than keep something in a very constricted space. She really tied that in as well to to improvisational musical practice, which I think is something probably resonates quite strongly here. So my conclusions in the paper were, first, I want to really champion the idea of hyper-personalized instruments. I like to refer to this as radically micro-scale design. I think there is value in taking a very careful, if that makes sense, sort of care-full and careful and personal approach to digital musical instrument design. In many ways, I see this as an outcome of a political stance that foregrounds care, sustainability, and critical engagement with the media ecologies that we are engaged with. More specifically, like in terms of how this is then enacted here, I want to consider how even using very huge, vast sound libraries can be converted into a tight and generative constraint through stripped down design techniques like using this single button. And thirdly, I want to suggest that most of us have huge and extremely meaningful sound libraries that we are not using. And I'm curious about what kinds of relationships can be built with our own sounds and our interfaces if we embrace the sounds that we have. With the implication being, of course, that this is an alternative to the relentless pursuit of new content and new instruments and new technology. Thank you very much for listening. I have no concept of what my timing was there. It's great to be back at NIME, though, and I'm looking forward to hearing any questions and thoughts and the remaining paper in the session.
Hi, Yann, really cool work. I think my question might be a bit off track, but I just wondered, because I think this session we talk a lot about the now, future, the past and the future, right? And I wondered how you see the future dimensions in your latest instrument. Yeah, that makes sense.
There was quite a lot of echo on that. So I could hear that you were talking about the past and the future. And the fact that there was echo on that is there's a lovely symmetry to that. But I am not sure I quite got the question.
Yeah. Is it better now, or?
I just it's very. I don't know.
Hi.
Oh yeah, that's way better.
Yeah, cool. I would just wonder. I mean, we had this session talking a lot about the past, the future. Now, in terms of the digital musical instruments, I just wanted, in your instrument, how you imagined about the future dimensions and yeah.
Yeah. Oh boy, man. Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, because it's interesting because immediately my feeling is like, oh, this is an instrument that is obsessive about the past, right? Like this is an instrument that is just like deeply obsessed with with how far away the past is getting from me, right? And it's kind of built on this idea that like we have built up these enormous sound library, these cloud video libraries that I'm using as a sound material. We've built them partially as a way of dealing with our own kind of inadequacy to understand that the past is gone, right? That we are recording a video because we're like, oh, I don't need to deal with this right now. I can make time to watch it later, right? And this idea of making time is just such a fascinating thing. And so this is an instrument that's entirely about the past and on one level. And so it's quite hard to imagine it like, and then when I'm making it for somebody else, it's like, oh, let's deal with your past now. Let's like, how big is your cloud library? And it becomes this kind of like back and forth, and it becomes this extremely personal, extremely micro scale thing that I'm like then becoming this sort of like guide towards to help somebody deal with their past and the way I dealt with my past. And so but on the other hand, I do see that as a sort of forward looking, a future oriented type of thing, because I think, well, there is so much that we can do with all of that. Like, I guess I'm trying to see it as an alternative to a future where we're obsessing about growth and new technologies. I think that's where I come to from it anyway.
Thank you. That was a really great paper and some really great question there. I think in the interest of time, we will need to move on. So please thank Yann. That was great.
Thank you very much.
So next up, perfect, everything works. So we have Hanyu, an epistemic DMI for cross-cultural reflection on time and music. Definitely do get good and close to that mic, just so we can all hear you.
Sure, thank you. Hi everyone, very glad to be here. And I'm Hanyu. I'm the presenter from Computational Media Art, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology.
I'm presenting on behalf of my authors, Arden, Hao, Hanqing, and Raul, who also told me this morning he wanted to extend his greetings to Sally and Paul from Trento. And I'll begin. My topic is OE and epistemic DMI for cross-cultural reflection on time and music. As you can see, this is my instrument O, the round one, and my instrument E, the straight one, from the picture. So how do I come up with this idea and this project is my fascination with the conception of time. Coming from a different cultural background, I was always fascinated of the musical timing and the cultural timing, as music is indeed an ephemeral art and cultural artifact. So learning from Thor Magnusson, I sort of adapted his view DMI as epistemic tool and his conversation with Claudia Monitor and composition as cultural technology. And I designed this instrument called OE, and then I invited my friend, composer Arden and Hao to do a co-composing activity as approach on reflection on action. So our goal is to see how this organic flow goes and reflect how DMIs help discover time perspective in music. A little bit more on my instrument of the design. The circular case, I wanted to inscribe, circular timing, which related with, more of Chinese musical time, I was thinking. And then linear case was Western musical time, I'm thinking. I sort of put the phrases everywhere because in every culture, both circular timing and linear timing exist. That's what I wanted to make it clear at the first place. Having these different time narratives in mind, and we look into the different kind of musical time conceptions. We have, in gamelan, there's recursive forms. There's also recursive forms and a very flexible tempo in Chinese music. And then we got also, very teleological narratives in Western music tradition, some influenced by eschatology. And so having those in mind, I designed the O and the E. Follow up on the design, the outer cases is 3D printed, and it's enclosed a custom designed PCB with LED light strips, and it harnessed ESP32, which has Wi-Fi enabled control functionality. And then in the in the lower part, you got the interactive boxes. I have light sensor, LDR sensor underneath as trigger controllers. This trigger controller meant to act, meant to make sound when illuminated by lights from the boards. The box utilize either ESP32 mini board or Shell ESP32 C3 or S3. And then comes to the most exciting part of co-composing. I handed out the co-composing manual to two of my composers, Italian composer Arden and Chinese composer Hao, who studies in the US and also very familiar with Western composition tradition. And I sort of gave them an instrument overview, and we met, we talked, and we do talk about our composition concept and talk about how we sort of wanted to put our understanding of musical time and our own understanding of cultural time into this composition. So during our composition process, we kept notes, diaries. I also recorded my conversations and discussions with Arden and Hao. And our goal is to make the workflow very organic and flexible and see how it goes towards the end. Sorry. Is that my connection? Sorry.
Come on.
Extend?
Yes. Why did you
Maybe I should unplug. I don't have a lot of slides, so I should be on time. It's weird. It's so weird.
Yeah, that's
very weird.
That's weird. That's fine. Here, 1 second.
Yeah. No, still not.
Oh.
Seems quite appropriate in a talk which has involved failure and the analogy towards musicians making time. If it doesn't work, can you continue without the slides?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah?
Sure. Yes.
You might have to keep talking for a bit.
I'll keep talking. As I invite you to bear with my voice, and yes.
Let's keep going.
Yeah, I'll keep going. So during our co-composition activity, I had Italian composer Arden's approach. His approach is basically make use of the E board, which is the linear timing, and he has a loop, and then he used the loop as repetitions, and as the repetitions are very recognizable, it's some sound he recorded from his daily life, and then the other sound and he called triggers will act as disruptive intervention. And then our Chinese composer, Hao, he took a different way of understanding Chinese musical time and then playing with this instrument. So he composed different excerpts of different Chinese musical from different Chinese musical tradition that manifest his understanding of Chinese time and Chinese musical time. And during this co-composing activities, we collected notes, diaries, and discussions. But in our paper, our reflection part, we only utilize the most significant outcomes we sort of learn from this activity and our very first reflection to sort of conclude what we did for this little project. So I wanted to share very interesting and exciting personal reflections by Arden and Hao, which I learned a lot. So for Arden, he said, ontologically, in his perspective, there's no such thing as circular time, as he conceived any musical act as linear in its development over time. He also said, I cannot disentangle the musical idea from the instrument itself. Therefore, for me, for Arden, it was very important to understand exactly the details of the interface. Arden has to take this into account as the number of actions that the performer, can actively apply are physically limited. And for personal reflections of how, it's very interesting. I had this deep conversation with him. It's both felt by both of us that when we sort of begin this project, we sort of confronted with the cultural dilemma of our time. So we also got this feeling of a persuasive sense of lagging behind, is that we are catching up. We are trying to learn the technologies we need to learn to establish a common discussion ground with our peers. And then the Arden felt, Hal felt the instrument not only could serve as a tool for musical creation, but also, does it work? Means of alleviating creative anxiety. Yes, it works. I will, and Hal also, oh, it doesn't work again. I'll just continue. Hal also believed that he has positive view toward this co-composing activity, that the new technologies at this disposal offer fresh perspectives. And he said, while the traditional method of transplanting ethnic elements directly into Western musical forms remains influential, I believe that the new technologies could offer a more nuanced exploration of cultural time. E instrument for him could serve as an existing rule for framework, which he can continue to study and refer to, while O, the instrument he concentrated on, would be the freeing and seeing how Chinese music time stands out. So after this co-composing activities, I started to reflect on many, cultural, social perspective of NIME that really lingers in my mind. So I wanted to invite you to let me read this quote from Vanessa Ogle, The Global Transformation of Time. She said, "In this world, it was time that served to measure and establish difference. Time was therefore always more than one just other category or standard that was internationalized and universalized in these decades, such as law, the metric system, or the women's movement. Time is what made the global imagination possible in the first place." I also read our chair's one of your article in the morning. You talked about the time perspective that most commercial, their rhythm system works that sort of limited our creativity. So our scholar, modern Chinese philosophers provide valuable insight into how time is understood and represented in Chinese thoughts, revealing a rich dynamic tradition that challenge our global temporal frameworks right now. The quote by one of my favorite scholars, Guosheng Wu, says, "The tyranny of time is reflected in the fact that time has become the baton of life and the supreme measure of value." Also observed by scholar Annie Liu in her article just recently, Catching Up with the West, historiographical stances in early accounts of Chinese electronic music. So scholar Annie Liu and most of the Chinese electronic music composers share the sentiments, quote, that is well encapsulated in the works and writings by figures such as Zhou Wenzhong, who frame musical aesthetics through the lens of Chinese philosophical concepts of time and space. So that brings a lot of fresh reflections for me and our composers to think that is time also an impediment in art. So I hope my little project could go on and then explore more, meanings and ideas of time and explore more interfaces while I'm learning, and invite more people to engage and share their personal knowledge of time, music, and new interfaces. Thank you. These are my bibliographies, and I wanted to thank Professor Mark Grimshaw-Argard and Professor Hans Kess for their insightful comments and guidance. That's it. Thank you.
That was a great paper and a great improvisation in the context.
Sorry for going over time. Have we got one relatively quick question?
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask a question about the term co-composing. Was it more of like an improvisational session, or was it notated for like future performances?
It's more of an improvisation session where we gather up and then we try to see how we could deal with this two boards, and then what kind of interactions could we do, and then they have to also consider my physical limitations, my gestures in manipulating those small LDR boxes. So it's more of an improvisation.
Were they improvising together or like more sequentially?
Sometimes it's together. Sometimes I meet with Arden individually to figure out the technical stuff, and then sometimes I meet with Hal individually, and sometimes we three of us just gather together.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
That was great. Thank you very much. Please thank all of the presenters and most of you for your tea and coffee. Thank you. Well done for dealing with that. Sorry, I didn't go any better likely. You actually. I wanted to say I love the way you go. I mean, I was reminded of Patricia and Zhou straightforward musicians with time expected. I mean, you're formulating, you're putting forth these two different forms, and different ways of different musicians do that. So I also frankly love the circle. Nowhere near as nice as yours.